By the time the first weak light reached the cedar planks of Cain Reynolds' cabin, he was already on his second task. At 68, he moved slower than he used to, but not by much, and never without purpose. He came down the back steps in a wool cap and old red suspenders, boots white with frost, carrying a steel rake for the intake screen on the microhydro line. The penstock hissed softly where it dropped from the creek, and he knelt at the box, pulled leaves and needles from the grate, then reached in bare-handed to clear a clot of alder catkins before ice could lock it. Water surged cleaner, turbine whined, and inside the cabin the single yellow porch bulb quit flickering and held steady. That was one box checked. Dawn had barely begun. He stood with his hands on his thighs for a moment, listening. Up here above the Lochsa drainage, quiet came layered. You heard current under rock, the soft knock of dead branches shifting against one another, the dry wing flick of ravens in the fir tops, and sometimes the tiny crackle from the weather radio in the kitchen if the battery got cold. There were no engines this early, no distant highway, no voices, unless he turned on his own. He didn't. 3 winters had passed since Marlene died, and Cain had learned there were 2 kinds of empty. The one that made men collapse into themselves, and the one you could pack with work until night. He chose the second and treated it like a fire line. Keep moving, keep your spacing, don't let it roll over you. By 7, he had split and stacked half a wheelbarrow of tamarack under the eave, checked the trap trail east of the cabin for blowdown, and hauled 2 5-gallon buckets from the creek in case the pump line froze again. By 8, he was at the porch bench, vice clamped to the edge, mending a bent mattock handle with brass screws and epoxy. Juniper lay under the bench in a crescent, one ear cocked toward the timber. She was a blue heeler with a mottled coat and a stare too intelligent for comfort. Cain had found her 6 years ago as a half-grown stray running a logging spur with wire in her paw and fear in her eyes. She had never completely stopped scanning horizons, but she had learned his rhythms the way good dogs do. When to stay close, when to fan out, when to put her chin on his knee and demand he look at something besides his own hands. 10 minutes, he told her now without looking up. Then line walk. Her tail thumped once on the boards. He wore old habits the way some men wore religion. Before retirement, he had jumped fires in 3 states and once in British Columbia, and even now he read weather by smell, and felt humidity changes in the ache of his left shoulder, where a snapped shroud line had dragged him across basalt in '92. He checked wind before opening doors. He watched crows for storm timing. He clocked cloud buildup over ridges and calculated distance to shelter without thinking about it. If a branch cracked in the woods, he knew roughly the weight that made that sound. People said skills like that made a man hard to surprise. People were mostly wrong. Grief had surprised him cleanly and without warning. It didn't feel like sadness most days. It felt like getting up from a chair and forgetting why you stood. He worked anyway. At noon he heated canned stew and ate at the counter facing the window, Juniper's muzzle resting on his boot. In the afternoon he drove 18 miles down Washboard to the mailboxes and back, passing no one but an Idaho fish and game truck headed the other way. Twice a week he checked in with Halverson, a retired surveyor farther up the slope, over VHF radio at 6 p.m. sharp. They traded weather, road conditions, and the occasional profanity about federal policy neither could change. Then the radio went silent again, and the valley returned to itself. Nights were worst in late October. Too early for full winter, too late for summer distractions. Dark came fast and wet. Rain tapped the roof in long diagonal runs. Moss took over the world 1 inch at a time. Cain would read old fire reports he had no reason to keep, sharpen blades that were already sharp, and pretend that routine was a cure instead of a crutch. That evening, after supper, He clipped Juniper's tracking collar and took her down the deer path that skirted the second growth stand west of the cabin. It was a loop they had walked 1,000 times. Slope, fern bench, blow-down pocket, then back-up slope before full dark. Juniper usually quartered ahead in smooth arcs, nose low, checking elk traces and rabbit scent. Halfway through the stand, she stopped. Not paused. Stopped. Rigid, one front paw lifted, ears pitched forward toward a tangle of wind-thrown fur and root plates about 40 yards downslope. Her body line went from loose to wire. Kane followed her gaze and saw nothing moving. Just sword fern, deadfall, and a shallow basin where old logging scars had filled with loam. Junie, heel. No response. He stepped forward, put 2 fingers at the back of her collar, and felt the vibration there. Barely perceptible, a low growl she kept sealed in her throat. Not fear, exactly. Alert. Easy, he said. Come on. She came because she always did, but she kept looking over her shoulder all the way home. The next evening she did it again, same place, same fixed stare. On the third evening, Kane brought a headlamp and took his time. He tied Juniper to a sapling upslope where she could see but not rush, then moved into the blowdown with a hooked pole, checking for fresh cougar scat. Cached kill, snares, human trash, anything concrete. He found elk droppings a week old, a fox trail, and a shallow depression under fern fronds tucked against an upturned root plate, as if something had bedded there and left. There was an odd smell in that pocket, musky and warm like wet hide and iron-rich earth, but as soon as wind shifted, it vanished. He crouched, touched the depression, still faintly pressed, not reins softened yet. No tracks he trusted, no blood, no fur. He stood, turned his lamp off, and listened. The woods held its breath and gave him nothing. Juniper whined once from uphill, small and urgent. I know, he said. Back at the cabin, he slept poorly and woke twice to her nails clicking across the floor as she moved from front window to back, then settled by the door facing the west timber. On the fourth evening, clouds sat low enough to comb the ridges, and sleet rattled intermittently against the porch rail. Kane finished stacking split rounds under tarp and watched Juniper pace tight circles, glancing between him and the tree line. At dusk, she planted herself at the top step, aimed her whole body west, and would not come inside. He swore under his breath, went to the mudroom shelf, and took down a hard case he had not opened in months. The thermal drone had been a practical purchase after the big burns, good for spotting holdover heat, mapping snagfall, checking inaccessible gullies before he committed old knees to bad terrain. Not military fancy, just a stout quadcopter with a stabilized FLIR unit, short-range transmitter, and enough battery for 32 minutes if wind behaved. He checked rotors, calibrated compass, slid in a full pack, and powered the controller. Juniper watched every move, muscles bunched like she understood what the machine was for. If this is a denning bear, he told her, you owe me one uninterrupted night's sleep. He launched from the clearing behind the woodpile. The drone climbed with a mosquito whine and tilted west, green position lights blinking through mist. On the tablet screen, the world resolved into temperature gradients, black trunks, charcoal ground, pale creek thread, and bright ghosts where living things held heat. Kane flew low over the stand, sweeping methodically in a grid. A pair of deer flashed white and bounded off. A raccoon glowed near a stump, nothing large in motion. He nudged the drone downslope toward the blowdown pocket where Juniper fixated. At first he saw only root mass and cold fern. Then, under the angled slab of uprooted earth, the image brightened and thickened into a shape too large for black bear, too compact for moose, wrong in proportion for any elk he had ever tracked. It was curled tight against the root plate, one broad upper limb hooked over something smaller tucked to its chest. Heat signature from the large body was intense at shoulder and core, cooler at the extremities. The smaller form registered but faintly, narrow, compact, barely above ambient. Kane zoomed in. The large shape did not move, not even a head turned toward rotor noise. If it heard the drone, it ignored it. He felt his own breath get shallow and forced it deeper. His hands stayed steady because that was muscle memory older than fear. Jesus, he said softly, then corrected himself to habit. No. Think. He ran a quick perimeter scan. No second adult, no obvious den structure, no reflective eyeshine in nearby brush. Just that one massive heat source wrapped around the small one in a hollow, too exposed for any sensible animal to choose in weather like this. Juniper had come to his knee without him noticing, and now stood pressed against his leg, eyes fixed not on the screen, but on the dark woods beyond it. She made a sound he had heard only once before, when she found a hit deer still alive on Highway 12, a low, uncertain keening that belonged more to concern than threat. He lowered altitude another 10 feet, trying to resolve limb geometry. The large shape shifted slowly, and Kane caught a clearer silhouette. Shoulder breadth impossible for a man in winter gear, forearm length out of scale, hand, if it was a hand, splayed across the smaller form as if shielding it. Kane killed his impulse to push closer. Curiosity got people hurt. So did disbelief. He lifted away, retraced the grid, then brought the drone home on reserve battery and set it down on the landing mat behind the shed with a gentle bump. Only when motors wound down did he realize his jaw hurt from clenching. Juniper nosed his wrist. He scratched between her ears without looking at her. Inside, he replayed footage at half speed, then quarter speed, then frame by frame. Same result every pass. A large, unknown biological heat signature sheltering in blowdown, with a smaller, inert companion. He had seen all kinds of damage in woods. Men burned through Nomex, elk with wire around necks, bear cubs orphaned when hunters took the sow out of season. He had hauled dead weight and living panic and every condition between. What he had never seen was this exact configuration, an impossible shape holding still for hours in freezing rain as if movement itself was forbidden. He closed the laptop and sat in the dark kitchen while sleet ticked the windows. Call somebody? Say what? There's a giant, unidentified primate in my timber with what looks like a juvenile? The county deputy already thought he was eccentric because he paid taxes in cash and preferred radio to cell service. Fish and game would come armed and curious. Armed. State biologists would bring interns. If rumor leaked, every idiot with a rifle and a podcast would be up this drainage by dawn. Whatever that thing was, animal, anomaly, something he lacked a word for, publicity would kill it faster than weather. Do nothing? Let it stay exposed in a cold sink while nighttime temperatures dropped into the teens by weekend? If it was injured, it might not relocate. If it was guarding young, it might not abandon. If it was dangerous, it had already chosen not to approach the cabin despite easy opportunity. He rose, walked to the wood stove, added 2 splits, and watched flame catch. Juniper settled at the back door, still facing west. "Okay," he said to her, voice rough. "Here are the rules." He spoke them like a briefing because briefings made chaos manageable. Maintain distance. No direct approach after dark. Gather evidence before acting. Watch pattern for 72 hours. Keep exits clear. Keep dogs safe. No outside calls until he could frame facts, not fear. He pulled out topo maps, spread them on the table and marked the hollow with pencil. Marked wind channels. Marked the old logging grade above the basin and the creek crossings below. He checked long-range forecast on weather radio. Incoming wet system. Possible snowline drop to 3,500 feet. Gusts from southwest. Bad place to linger. Near midnight, he stepped onto the porch in his coat and listened toward the west stand. For a long time there was only drizzle and distant creek rush. Then just once he felt a vibration more than heard it, a low, drawn-out note that seemed to travel through cedar planks into his boots. Juniper lifted her head before he did, ears forward, body tense but not aggressive. Not a cougar scream, not elk, not any bear vocalization he knew. A sound like strain. Kane stood in the dark with one hand on the porch post and understood, with the clean certainty that had kept him alive in fire country, that whatever occupied that hollow was not passing through. It was anchored, hurt or grieving, or both. And if weather closed in hard, the margin between surviving and not would narrow to hours. By morning, this would no longer be curiosity. It would be a problem with teeth and consequence. He looked down at Juniper. "You weren't warning me off," he said quietly. "You were standing watch." Her eyes flicked toward the trees again, patient and insistent. Kane went back inside, set 3 drone batteries on charge, and laid out his field kit on the counter. Optics, med pouch, jerky, trauma blanket, headlamp, sidearm he hoped not to unholster. Outside, sleet turned to wet snow and began to collect in the seams of the deck. He did not pray. He did not drink. He did what he always did when the world offered him an impossible assignment. He prepared for first light. The batteries hummed faintly on the counter, little green lights crawling from 1 bar to 2. Kane sat at the table in his coat, map spread under his forearms, and waited for the coffee water to boil without tasting the air in his own kitchen. Juniper never lay down. She stood by the back door through the dark hours, weight shifted forward, ears pivoting toward the west timber every few minutes, as if tracking a signal that came and went, below hearing. Twice she gave that same low, uncertain sound. Twice Kane stepped outside and listened until sleet soaked his hat brim. The second time he felt that deep, almost sub-audible note again in his sternum, like someone had struck a distant bass string underground. By 4:30, wet snow was sticking in the grass seams and turning the yard to grey slush. Kane packed his field bag by touch. Rangefinder binoculars, compact spotting scope, thermal monocular, first aid pouch, 2 emergency blankets, jerky, line, folding saw, and the old orange survey tape he used for quick trail marks. He left the sidearm on the counter, picked it up again, then set it back down a final time. "Not today," he muttered. At first light, he and Juniper moved out. He took the upper contour trail instead of dropping directly into the stand, circling for wind advantage and elevation. Years of fireline and backcountry rescue had taught him one unglamorous truth. If you didn't know exactly what waited below, you earned your information from above first. The snow thinned under thick cedar, then returned in open pockets where second-growth fir had not yet closed canopy. Juniper ranged 10 yards ahead, then checked back, then ranged again, making no unnecessary sound. At the shoulder above the blowdown basin, Kane went prone behind a mossed log and raised binoculars. The pocket looked different in daylight. Yesterday's tangle now showed shape and intent. Several snapped saplings had been dragged and leaned against the upturned root plate, interlocked in a rough V that broke wind from the prevailing southwest. Not random storm throw, deliberate placement. Fern fronds had been layered in thicker mats on the uphill side where runoff would sheet. Alder branches with leaves still attached were woven through openings like crude thatch. He lowered the glass slowly. No movement in the shelter. He held for 5 minutes, then 10, scanning edges. Nothing. When he finally shifted down 2 body lengths for a better angle, his gloved hand pressed into mud beside a print and stopped him cold. He brushed the surface clean with 2 fingers. The impression was long, longer than his spread hand, 4-foot shape with clear heel pad and 5 toe marks. The toes tapered and curved slightly inward, not splayed hoof, not paw. Finger-like. The depth suggested weight he did not want to guess. Next to it, partly overprinted, was another track from the same footfall sequence, this one shallower on the lateral edge, heavier on heel and inner forefoot, as if the maker rolled weight to avoid pain. Limp. He followed the trackway with his eyes rather than his boots. It moved from shelter to a seep 30 yards north, then back by a slightly different line. Maximum excursion, maybe 50 yards, just like the thermal. Juniper froze beside him, nose lifted, then looked at Kane instead of toward the hollow, waiting for instruction. "Stay," he whispered. He inched backward to the crest, then set up the spotting scope on low tripod and watched for another 30 minutes. Once, a dark mass shifted under the sapling lean-to, no more than the suggestion of shoulder. He saw no face, no full profile. But he saw enough scale to make his pulse settle into that old operational cadence. Acknowledge what is, not what should be. On the walk back, weather thickened. Needles of sleet rattled through branches. By noon, the forecast upgraded to a winter advisory over radio. Sustained cold front, nighttime lows in the teens, mixed precip, gusting wind. Bad place to shelter. Worse place to grieve, he thought, without meaning to choose that word. That afternoon, Juniper did something Kane had never seen her do. He sliced venison jerky at the counter while she sat close, eyes tracking each strip. He tossed her one. She caught it, then carried it, not to her rug, not under the table, but straight to the back door. She waited until he opened it, trotted to the edge of the yard where meadow gave way to trees, set the jerky in the snow, and stepped back. She stood over it a moment, ears forward, then returned for another strip. "Junie," Kane said. She ignored him and repeated the ritual 3 more times, laying each piece near the first without touching any. By dusk, the little offering sat dark against whitening ground. Nothing came to take it while he watched, but Juniper would not cross that boundary line. She paced between porch and tree edge, as if honoring an invisible perimeter. At full dark, Kane launched the drone again. He flew higher first, mapping heat in broad sweeps, then descended on a shallow approach to avoid direct rotor wash into the hollow. On screen, the large signature glowed where expected under the root plate. The smaller form lay tight against its torso. Kane switched palettes, adjusted contrast, logged coordinates. 22 minutes into the flight, the larger shape uncoiled. It rose to a crouch with a stagger on the left side, exactly where the track had suggested injury, and moved north to the seep. Gait pattern confirmed, shortened stride, guarded load on one leg. It knelt, drank or scooped water, hard to tell from thermal alone, then turned immediately back to the shelter. No foraging circuit, no exploratory movement. Just out and back fast as pain allowed. Pain. When it settled again, one arm wrapped the smaller form, and heat at its thorax spiked and dropped in deep cycles. Kane watched until battery warning flashed. Night 2 repeated almost precisely. Night 3 introduced the thing that cracked him. At 0:47, the large figure shifted upright and bent over the smaller one. Its upper limbs moved in a rhythm that, in thermal silhouette, looked horrifyingly familiar. Press, pause, press, rock, hold. Not efficient resuscitation, not anything trained, but the same desperate pattern humans enact when refusal outruns acceptance. It stopped, gathered the small shape close, and began a slow forward-back sway that never changed position. Kane's thumb hovered over the controller and slipped off the stick. He set the unit on the table, screen still alive, and sat with both palms flat against his knees, breathing through his nose until the kitchen stopped tilting. Hospice had taught him more than he wanted to know about helpless hands. The last week Marlene was home, he had learned the rhythm of morphine hours by sound, kettle whistle, pill timer, her breath catching, his own voice saying, "I'm here," like a useless metronome. One night after she went, he had woken in her chair, with his hand outstretched toward blankets that were no longer warm and understood, briefly and completely. How a mind can stay tethered to what is gone, because the alternative is stepping into open air. Now a thing in his woods, unknown, impossible, real, was doing its own version under freezing rain. He closed the tablet. Juniper lifted her head from the threshold and watched him with that steady, unnerving compassion dogs offer when they decide a human is the one needing supervision. "Don't start with me," he said softly. She came anyway and pressed her shoulder to his shin. Complications stacked like weather fronts. By the fourth day, sleet had built a skin of ice over downed branches. The basin where the shelter sat became a cold sink by late afternoon, air pooling and refusing to circulate. Kane measured temperatures at his porch and on the ridge with two cheap sensors. The hollow averaged 6 to 8 degrees colder after sunset. If the large creature was already injured, that differential mattered. He considered calling Halverson on radio, then imagined the old surveyor's silence turning to questions Kane could not answer without detonating the entire valley. He considered fish and game again, drafted a factual script in his head, rejected it line by line. Too big, too weird, too vulnerable. Institutional curiosity would arrive with tranquilizer protocols, sidearms, and press leaks by day 2. He made himself list options in a notebook. 1. Non-intervention. Outcome likely fatal with incoming cold. 2. Direct approach on foot. Unknown threat response. High risk. 3. Indirect aid at distance. Moderate risk. Uncertain benefit. 4. Notify authorities broadly without location specifics. Buys time, maybe. Invites scrutiny later. He stared at the page until Juniper whuffed at the door. Outside, she performed her jerky ritual again, then added something new. She carried a strip halfway to the tree line, set it down, and backed away with her head low, eyes averted, body curved sideways in a textbook appeasement posture Kane had seen her use once with an injured stray dog years ago. Submission without surrender, an offering without challenge. The strip was gone by morning. No tracks clear enough to read. Overnight crust had broken and refrozen in ugly granular shards. But the food was gone, and a shallow impression, too broad to be deer, too defined to be slump, marked the margin where trees began. Kane shifted to planned support. He staged materials in the shed. 2 blue tarps, paracord, an old canvas painter's drop cloth to mute colour, 5-litre water jugs, saline bags from a disaster med kit he kept for backcountry accidents, broad-spectrum veterinary antibiotics left over from treating Juniper's puncture wound last spring, and frozen salmon fillets from his chest freezer. He didn't pretend he had a treatment protocol for an unknown species. He had triage principles: warmth, hydration, calories, reduce stress, avoid provoking fight response. Still, each move created new risk. Approach too close, and he could trigger flight into deeper timber, where tracking in storm conditions would fail. Leave human scent too near, and he might contaminate behavior or draw aggression. Offer wrong food and worsen illness. Medicate blindly and do harm. Do nothing, and watch weather finish what injury began. On the fifth night, wind shifted east and carried sound cleaner through the drainage. Kane stood on the porch with collar up and finally heard what Juniper had been hearing for days. A low-frequency call stretched thin with strain, not loud enough to carry like a howl, but deep enough to vibrate in ribs. It came in long intervals, then silence, then another. Not threat display, not territorial challenge. A summoning tone aimed at something that did not answer. Juniper didn't bark. She sat, chest forward, listening like a sentry. "Yeah," Kane whispered into the dark. "I hear it now." At 2:10, his thermal pass showed the large figure moving farther than before. 52 yards to the seep, then a short detour toward the jerky drop, then back. Limp worsened on return. Core heat remained high. Distal limbs cooler than earlier nights. The smaller form did not move at all. By dawn, the implication had started to harden in him, but he resisted naming it. He had spent too much of his life around scenes where naming too early made people sloppy. Verify first. He waited until evening for one more pass. Snow fell straight down at dusk, thick wet flakes that blurred depth and swallowed sound. Kane launched from under the porch eave to keep rotors dry, climbed through the curtain, and leveled at 30 meters before angling west. The thermal feed cut through weather better than his eyes could. Trunks appeared as black pillars. Ground radiated dull grey. The hollow flashed on screen in white and orange. The large shape lay where always, curled around the small bundle. Kane adjusted emissivity, zoomed and held steady despite crosswind nudging the drone. He watched the little form for 1 full minute, then 2, then 5. No change in contour, no respiratory rise, no heat variance above background. Where earlier nights it had registered faintly warmer than surrounding ferns, now it read nearly ambient, a cooled object retaining only borrowed warmth where pressed to the larger chest. Not sleeping, not sick, gone. He felt the conclusions settle into place with the quiet brutality of a snapped latch. Infant, he thought, or juvenile. Dead long enough to lose thermal identity unless held. The larger creature lifted its head, and for the first time, Kane caught a direct acoustic pickup through the drone mic. A subharmonic moan threaded with breath, low enough to clip the sensor. Juniper, inside by the stove, stood instantly and stared at the monitor, as if the sound had crossed species and circuitry alike. "You've been hearing that all week," Kane said. Her ears twitched. She stepped closer to the screen, then backed away, restless. Kane remembered all the evenings she had fixed on that same patch of woods, refusing to leave not because she scented predator, but because she had marked suffering and done the only thing a dog could do at distance: keep watch until someone else understood. He swallowed once, hard, and made his decision. Observer phase was over. He spent an hour building a plan measured in 10-yard increments. Approach route from downwind along the old elk cut to minimize silhouette. Drop point 70 yards from shelter behind the alder snag. No direct line of sight into hollow. Movement, masked by drone audio. Recorded forest wash and creek noise played through the speaker to blur singular human sounds. Aid cache packed in scent-neutral contractor bags. Saline, fish, jerky, 2 wrapped antibiotic blister packs sealed inside waxed paper, and a folded tarp pre-tied to quick-deploy cord. He waited until midnight when thermal showed the large figure make its usual seep run. As soon as it moved north, he sent the drone to hover 20 feet east of the shelter, broadcasting low, natural sound, then hustled downslope in snow-muted darkness, heart rate old but obedient. Juniper stayed at heel without command, silent as ash. At the alder snag, he dropped to a knee, set the cache beneath overhanging fern, and clipped one tarp corner to a branch, where prevailing wind would push it as a partial break toward the hollow without requiring him to enter the core space. He poured saline into a shallow steel pan and set it beside the fish. Human scent everywhere, despite precautions, but less intrusive than stepping under the root plate. He backed out exactly in his own prints. On the ridge, he recovered the drone, retreated to the porch, and watched. 7 minutes later, the large signature returned, paused at the edge of the hollow, then stopped hard, detecting change. Kane's throat tightened. The figure remained motionless for so long, he wondered if it would bolt. Then, slowly, it shifted position between the shelter and the cache, body angled protectively over the small form. Guarding, assessing. It did not charge, it did not flee. After another minute, it extended one arm toward the pan, drew back, then reached again. Heat bloomed briefly at hand and face level as it brought moisture in. Next, it touched the fish, held and withdrew, as if uncertain. Finally, it gathered the smaller bundle closer and resumed that terrible rocking motion, now with the tarp edge above it, cutting a fraction of wind. Kane sat very still in his kitchen chair, controller cooling in his hands. For the first time since Marlene's funeral, he recognized the sensation moving through him as something other than endurance. Not routine, not duty, something chosen and vulnerable and plain. Tenderness, he thought, almost angrily, as if naming it might break it. Juniper laid her chin on his knee and exhaled. "Yeah," he said to her, watching the grainy white figures on screen hold their impossible vigil in the storm. "We do what we can." Outside, snow thickened over the valley, and in the west timber, the low, grieving note rose once more, faint, chest-deep, answered now by the small mechanical hum of a drone on standby and the steady pulse of a cabin light that did not go out. He kept the live feed up until the battery warning blinked red, and the drone auto-returned, and even after it landed, he sat there listening to the rotors tick down in the cold. At 3:12, Juniper lifted her head before any sound reached him. At 3:14, he heard it. Brush cracking downslope, quick and coordinated, not the heavy, laboured cadence he had learned from the hollow. Lighter feet, multiple bodies. Kane killed the porch light and stepped into the dark with the thermal monocular. 3 heat signatures moved through second-growth fir on the west bench, low and fluid, then paused in a staggered line 50 yards short of his meadow. Canids. Probably wolves come down from higher country with weather pressure. One tested forward, stopped, and looked toward the tree line where the jerky had been left. Juniper stood rigid, no bark, teeth barely showing. "Inside," Kane whispered. She didn't move. The wolves never entered the meadow. They drifted south in a loose arc and vanished into timber. 10 minutes later, from the direction of the hollow, a single sharp yelp cut off mid-note, followed by silence so complete it made his skin prickle. By dawn, he found tracks where the snow crust held. 3 adults, medium-large, healthy. They had circled wider around the blowdown basin than around his cabin. Predators reading risk. Scent map widening. That changed everything. He wasn't just trying to keep an injured unknown alive through cold. He was now trying to prevent scavenger pressure from forcing it to move before it could. He checked the cache from standoff optics. The fish was gone. Saline pan overturned. 1 antibiotic packet still there, unopened. The tarp had shifted but remained catching wind on the uphill side. Good enough for one night, maybe. By mid-morning, his weather radio shifted tone from winter advisory to unstable front language, cold trough pulling out, dry air intruding aloft, gust variability. He didn't like that combination in slash country. not in late-season fuels that looked wet and still carried cured needles underneath. At noon, another problem walked in on 2 feet. Engine noise came from the lower spur where nobody should have been this week. Kane cut his splitter and listened. One side-by-side UTV, maybe 2 men by the voices, moving slow and stopping often, the pattern of people hunting or looking for shed antlers where both were out of season. He watched from behind stacked rounds as the vehicle appeared between alder trunks below his driveway. No county decal, no agency rig. Civilian. 1 man in blaze orange cap, 1 in camo hoodie. The camo one stood in the bed-to-glass uphill, toward the west stand. Kane stepped into view deliberately, waved once, and did not smile. They rolled up near his gate, tires chewing mud. "Road dead ends up here," Orange Cap called. "Private easement," Kane said. "Turnaround's back at the culvert." Camo scanned Kane's shed, porch, then Juniper at his heel. "You see any big tracks up top? We found weird ones by the creek. Maybe somebody's pranking with fake feet." Kane kept his face blank. Snow does odd things to thaw and refreeze. They lingered too long, asking about elk movement and if he'd heard coyotes. Kane answered with weather and road conditions and nothing else. Eventually they backed down, spraying gravel, but not before Camo held his phone out the window, panning the tree line like he was collecting footage. Juniper watched until engine noise faded, hackles high. "What we lose," Kane said to the empty road, "if idiots get curious. Not just the creature, everything, privacy, valley access, any chance of helping without a spectacle. If rumors started, he'd have drones from every amateur cryptid channel in Idaho by weekend. If agencies arrived blind and armed, that hollow would become a trap." He spent the afternoon erasing sign where he could, brushing his own prints near cache route, shifting old branches over obvious approach lines, removing leftover jerky drops from meadow edge so scavengers wouldn't pattern his yard. Every action felt like triage with too few hands. At dusk, the low call came again from the west timber, thinner now, interrupted by coughing exhalations. Juniper pressed against his leg, trembling once before she stilled. "Yeah," he said, "I know." He made a bad choice because good choices were running out. He told himself it was controlled risk. The limp had worsened. Distal heat on the thermal feed kept falling. If infection had set in, delay could kill faster than weather. He decided to deliver 1 antibiotic dose concealed in salmon fat and leave pain meds he could at least identify by weight and dissolution, not by hope. No approach inside 40 yards. No direct eye line. Drone overhead, masking sound. At 2340, he launched under clearing skies and a mean crosswind. Clouds had torn open to a hard moon, and the exposed air made rotor drift, twitchy. He compensated, took the drone up, and watched the larger signature begin its seep movement right on schedule. "Now," he said. He and Juniper moved down the elk cut, crouched, silent. At the alder snag, he knelt to slide the packet beneath fish skin, fingers clumsy in cold. Juniper stood behind him, facing the hollow, tail stiff. Then wind sheared sideways down the draw. On screen, the drone jolted. Kane corrected left. A branch he hadn't mapped flexed in gust and clipped rotor 3. The quad spun, recovered half a second, then dropped hard into brush 20 yards short of the shelter with a high, metallic scream. Everything broke at once. The large heat signature wheeled, not toward the seep now, but toward the crash, then toward Kane's position in one explosive movement that erased any illusion of slowness. It was on 2 legs for 3 strides, then dropped forward to negotiate deadfall, speed terrifying despite the limp. "Back," Kane hissed, grabbing Juniper's collar. She slipped free and darted left, drawing motion away from him in pure healer instinct. Flare wide, redirect threat. Kane lunged after her, boot hit ice-hidden root, and he went down hard, sliding 10 feet into a shallow gully. Pain lit his right knee, white hot. He bit back a shout and rolled behind a cedar stump as something massive crashed through brush above. He saw only fragments in moon-sliced dark. A shoulder like a wet boulder, arm sweep, steam breath. Juniper yelped, short, sharp, then silence, then her nails scrabbling as she bolted downslope toward him. The creature stopped where he had knelt. It seized the fish bundle, flung it aside, and gave a chest-deep bark that shook snow from branches. Not random rage, warning, boundary. Kane stayed low, palms open in mud, forcing himself not to meet its gaze. "We're leaving," he said, voice barely there. "We're leaving." For a long 10 seconds, nothing moved but his breath. Then the crashing retreated. By the time he risked lifting the monocular, the heat signature was back at the hollow, body curved over the small form, broad back toward him, like a door slammed shut. Kane crawled to where Juniper crouched behind Blowdown. Blood striped her shoulder, dark against mottled fur. Not arterial, thank God, but a deep rake, likely from glancing contact with branch or claw. He couldn't tell. She licked his wrist once and leaned into him, shaking. "You did not have to do that," he whispered, and immediately knew she had. Getting out took 40 minutes and cost him pride he didn't have to spare. His knee wouldn't bear full load. He improvised a crutch from a sapling and half-carried Juniper uphill through crusted snow, while the moon watched like a witness who offered no help. On the porch he got her under light, clipped fur, irrigated the wound, and placed 3 loose sutures with hands that remembered field medicine too well. Juniper never snapped, just panted and stared at the wall while he worked. His own knee had ballooned by the time he finished, likely ligament strain, maybe partial tear. Not crippling, but enough to make steep ground dangerous. At 2 o'clock, he limped to the crash site perimeter with binoculars and confirmed what he already feared: drone broken. One arm snapped at the motor mount, gimbal hanging by ribbon cable. Thermal core maybe intact, maybe not. He couldn't retrieve it without re-entering the boundary he had just violated. He had lost the one tool that let him help at distance. Worse, he had burned trust. At dawn, the cache remained untouched except for clawed dirt over the fish he had altered. The message was clear in any language. No more. Back inside, Kane sat at the table with gauze wrappers and stripped screws and felt the old, familiar edge of failure climb up his throat. Maybe he had projected grief onto an animal that would never permit aid. Maybe he had mistaken tolerance for permission. Maybe his need to do something had made him dangerous to the very thing he meant to protect. Juniper, bandaged and exhausted, dragged herself under his chair anyway. Uncertain outcome was no longer theoretical. It was in his swollen knee, his dog-stitched shoulder, and a dead drone lying in wet brush between him and the hollow. Juniper woke to the smell of iron and antiseptic and Kane's pulse, fast and wrong. She did not have words for memory the way he did. She had scent pictures. Pain cold wire from years ago, metal taste in mouth, men's boots passing too near and never stopping, engine thunder, hunger. The day Kane crouched on a logging spur with one hand open and eyes down, not reaching until she chose it. Now, his smell carried that same edge she remembered from storms, and from the night he came home from town with Marlene's blanket and sat on the floor until dawn, not moving, salt water from his face, ash from the stove, empty. Juniper kept watch because that was what pack meant after loss. She had heard the low calls in the west stand before he did, felt them in paws, in sternum, in teeth. Not prey sound, not challenge, the sound of one alone and not accepting aloneness. She had waited at the trees because leaving that sound unanswered felt like abandoning a denmate. When the loud insect fell from sky and the huge one rushed, Juniper did what her body knew. Brake line, pull force sideways. Make space for old male with bad knee and soft hands. She did not know if the blow on her shoulder was branch or hand. She knew only impact and Kane's blood-scent spike and the command in his voice that meant stay alive now. Under the table, she listened to him move around the cabin, heavier on one leg. He dropped screws twice trying to open the spare parts tin. He cursed once, then apologized to nobody. He took her bandage off at noon, cleaned the wound again, fingers gentler than pain required. "I'm sorry," he said into her neck fur. "I should have left it alone." She licked his wrist because licking was the closest thing to answer. Outside, wind changed. New scents rode in, sun on cold bark, old smoke far away, and something sharp like sky metal. Juniper stood, shoulder protesting, and went to the door. Kane followed slower. At the threshold she hesitated. The west timber held the huge one's scent, now layered with alarm and distrust, and beneath it, the small, still scent that did not change. Juniper whined once, not at fear of being hurt, but at the feeling of two packs pulling opposite directions. Protect Kane here, stand watch there. He rested his hand on her back, and she felt the tremor in it. "We'll do better," he said, maybe to her, maybe to the trees. She wanted to believe him. Dogs always did, until proven otherwise. That evening she refused food until he ate first. Then she carried half her ration to the meadow edge, set it down, and came back, limping. She no longer approached as close as before. Boundaries had teeth now. In the dark, she dreamed of running fence lines between two fires she could not see, only smell, while both called her by different names. By late afternoon the next day, winter broke like glass. Temperature jumped 12 degrees in 3 hours. Snow on branches sloughed in wet sheets. Wind went erratic. Downslope gusts, then dead calm. Then sudden warm drafts that carried resin and dust from ridges that should have stayed damp this time of year. Kane stood on the porch with his bad knee braced and did not like the feel of the air. His weather radio crackled with clipped voices from district channels. Dry lightning reported east of Powell Ranger Station. Lookout saw 2 single tree strikes. Resources monitoring for holdovers. No immediate threat. Holdovers were liars. He knew that better than most. He spent the evening at his bench trying to resurrect the drone from spare parts cannibalized off an older mapping quad. The crashed thermal unit still lay unrecoverable inside the creature's boundary, so this half-repaired machine was a different airframe repurposed to carry what he could salvage. New arm epoxied and splintered with aluminum strap, motor swapped, gimbal jury-rigged with zip ties and hope. Thermal feed came up, then glitched, then held if he didn't yaw too hard. Flight time uncertain. Range uncertain. Reliability cursed, not fixed, not trustworthy, but maybe enough. At 2037, Juniper lifted from her rug and growled low at the west window. Kane stepped out and saw it. A faint orange pulse on the opposite ridge. Gone, then back, then a thin vertical smear darkening the twilight sky. He grabbed binoculars. Through the glass, 1 torching snag became 3. Then a crawl of ground fire lit in slash below it, moving faster than slope and fuel moisture should have allowed, pushed by gusts funneling straight toward the drainage like breath through a tube. His radio erupted, dispatch tones, unit numbers, coordinates he recognized too well. The reported polygon sat broad and vague, miles wide. Nobody yet knew about the bowl with the root plate and the grieving giant that might not run until smoke sat on its chest. Kane laid the Beano down and opened his topo map with one palm. From that hollow there were only two viable exits on a bad leg. Down creek through choke brush and deadfall that would become a chimney once wind aligned, or up to the abandoned logging grade above his cabin, where old cuts and sparse fuels gave a narrow, survivable corridor. He traced the line with a calloused finger. It matched the one he had marked nights ago, just in case. Juniper paced, bandage bright against her shoulder, eyes darting between him and West Timber. If he called dispatch with exact location, he might bring helicopters, crews, attention. Too slow for tonight, too visible for ever after. If he stayed silent, smoke would do the decision-making for all of them. Outside, wind shifted hard south, and the orange line on the ridge brightened as another snag went up like a match. Kane looked at the half-repaired drone on his bench, then at his dog, then into the trees, where the low call had gone thin and intermittent. "Damn it," he said, already reaching for his Pulaski. The first ash flecks began to fall on the porch rail. Ash flecks landed on the porch rail and melted into black pinpricks. Kane shoved his right knee brace tighter, cinched it with numb fingers, and hauled the Pulaski from its hook. The handle felt right in his palm in a way almost nothing had since he left jump work. He took the old steel from under the bench, checked chain tension, topped bar oil, and clipped a headlamp over his wool cap. Inside, the radio hissed dispatch traffic in clipped bursts. Single tree strike now established. Rate of spread, moderate. Resources en route from Powell. He keyed his handheld on county frequency. "Dispatch, this is Reynolds on Upper West Fork Private, retired smoke jumper. I've got visual on active ground fire moving west to east on opposite ridge, dropping into drainage. Approximate sector Charlie 7 by local map. Recommend immediate structure and wildlife corridor assessment above old logging grade." "Copy, Reynolds," a woman answered. "Any occupied structures threatened?" "One occupied. Mine. I can prep defensible space." He looked toward the west stand and chose each word like stepping stones. "Drainage bowl below grade will chimney if wind holds. Don't send folks in blind after dark." "Understood. Engines and one-eye A crew rolling. Air at first safe light if needed." He let go of the mic. Broad location. No hollow pin dropped. Juniper stood at the threshold, bandaged shoulder stiff, eyes lit by orange flicker from the ridge. "Not optional tonight," he told her. "You stay wide. You don't hero this." Her tail gave one sharp twitch as if filing the order and reserving the right to ignore parts of it. They moved. The abandoned logging grade ran like a scar above his cabin, half swallowed by alder and slide. Kane had pre-marked the line on his map days ago. Now he cut by memory, limping, swinging Pulaski into duff and roots, carving a handline where fire might otherwise creep across. Every chop sent pain up his knee. He set his jaw and kept rhythm. Scrape to mineral soil, toss, step, breathe. Juniper ranged 10 yards ahead and back again, reading wind. Smoke thickened fast, low and greasy. On the opposite slope, torching snags boomed like distant artillery. Embers began landing in the slash around him, tiny orange teeth testing for purchase. He cleared 50 yards, then 80, then 110 down toward the bowl. When the grade kinked around a basalt outcrop, he dropped the Pulaski, pulled the repaired drone from its case and set it on a patch of scraped dirt. The patched arm looked crooked in headlamp glare. He didn't trust it. He needed it. He taped 2 chemical hand warmers to the belly to increase thermal profile and zip-tied a lightweight speaker pod beneath the gimbal. On the controller, he cued the same neutral creek and wind track he'd used before. "Stay behind me," he told Juniper. He launched. The drone lifted, wobbled, corrected. Thermal feeds stuttered once and then resolved through smoke. Hot ribbon of fire chewing/upslope, cooler black timber above grade, and in the bowl, the white mass under the root plate, still anchored around the smaller, dim bundle. "Of course you stayed," he muttered. He walked downslope while flying, keeping his body downwind and his eyes off the hollow. The drone hovered 20 feet above the bowl and began broadcasting soft water noise. Rotor hum layered over crackling brush fire. Kane took the Pulaski in one hand, a fire swatter in the other, and beat out embers that landed on his cut line. "Come on," he said under his breath, not sure if he meant the fire or the creature. "Come on." A gust hit. Smoke rolled through in one black sheet. The thermal image fuzzed with particulate. Then the large signature moved. It rose upright in one powerful, painful motion, limped 2 steps, stopped. Kane could see it through smoke now without optics. A towering silhouette, shoulders broad as a doorframe. One arm clamped around a wrapped shape against its chest. Juniper had gone wide left without command, circling the bowl at distance, not barking, just appearing and disappearing through smoke like a small, blue-grey ghost, keeping pressure off the line. Kane lowered his gaze to the dirt, turned his body sideways, and pointed the Pulaski uphill toward the grade. "Up," he said, voice low and even. "Go up, not me, up." The creature barked once, a chest-thumping blast that rattled his sternum. Kane didn't flinch. He nudged the drone backward along the cut line, letting heat and sound drift uphill like a moving marker. Another torching snag exploded on the ridge. The fire front found a run of cured needles and accelerated downslope. Kane heard that ugly, hungry hiss, change pitch. Now, he backed uphill, swatting embers, dragging the drone slowly ahead. The creature followed 3 limping strides, stopped, turned half back toward the hollow, as if the place itself had a hook in it. Kane felt time shear thin. "Not there," he said louder. "You stay, you die there." Juniper darted across the rear of the bowl, drawing the creature's glance uphill again. Kane swore at her, then used it, pulled the drone another 10 yards toward the grade. The creature moved. Smoke swallowed them all. At the first choke point, slash from an old thinning operation lay piled chest high on both sides of the grade. Kane had meant to clear more this summer and hadn't. Now fire dropped into the debris with a dry roar, flame lengths jumping from 2 feet to 8 in seconds. He killed the drone hover, landed it hard on the grade, grabbed the saw, and yanked the starter cord. It coughed, then caught. He plunged bar first into a hung-up fir that blocked the only passable lane, chips spraying, chain whining. Heat hit his face like opening an oven. Behind him, he felt rather than saw the creature halt in the smoke, unwilling to pass close. 30 seconds, Kane rasped to nobody. A spot fire jumped the handline on his right. Juniper lunged and barked at it as if barking could push flame back. Kane dropped the saw, beat the spot with the swatter until it flattened, then cut again. His knee buckled. He caught himself on the saw housing, dragged breath, kept going. The trunk gave with a cracking groan and rolled just enough to open a narrow slot. He killed the saw and kicked it aside. "Through!" he shouted, arm out, eyes still down. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the creature came, massive in the smoke column, ducking under branches, cradling the small wrapped bundle tight to its chest with impossible gentleness. It passed within 12 feet of Kane. He saw details in fragments: wet dark hair matted with ash, a scarred left thigh where the limp originated, hand proportions that made his own look child-small, eyes deep-set and fixed on him for one hard second before sliding away. No charge, no bluff, just motion. Kane grabbed the drone and limped after, Juniper flanking. They climbed the grade in a staggered procession while fire pushed below like a pursuing tide. Twice the creature slowed and angled downslope, drawn back toward the bowl. Twice Kane flew the drone ahead and to the left, creating a moving heat point on the escape line. Twice Juniper appeared on the outside arc, keeping pressure inward with perfect stock dog geometry. At the creek crossing above his cabin, the grade narrowed to a bridge of rock and old fill between two drop-offs. Flames had not reached it yet, but ember wash was thick, and a dead hemlock above leaned with roots burning through. Kane heard it pop. "Move!" he yelled. The hemlock fell across the rear of the root with a shower of sparks, severing the path behind them and throwing a wave of heat that forced Kane to his knees. The creature bounded the crossing in 2 strides despite the limp and gained the black timber beyond. Juniper sprinted after and stopped at the tree line, turned to check Kane. He was still in the open. Embers caught dry moss at his feet. He slapped them out, grabbed the drone case and lurched across the crossing as a tanker's first drop came in low over the ridge, red slurry hissing through crowns, steam and chemical tang filling the night. He dove behind a stump in black timber just as retardant splashed the edge of the grade. For a long minute there was only roar, hiss, and his own blood pounding. When he looked up, the creature stood 15 yards away in shadow, towering, bundle still held against its chest. It turned its head toward him fully this time. No aggression now. No panic, just a long, unreadable regard through smoke and ember drift. Kane lowered his eyes and nodded once. The creature crossed into deeper black and disappeared uphill without a sound. Air support and engines turned the next 2 hours into organized chaos. Kane stayed in the black while 2 tanker runs painted the ridge and an IA crew anchored off the lower road. By 200, the main push into his drainage had slowed from run to creep. Spotting continued, but the immediate funnel toward the bowl was broken. An engine captain in yellow Nomex found him at first light near the grade, face striped with soot, Juniper at his boot. "You Reynolds?" the captain asked. "That's me." "We got your call. You alone up here?" "Just me and the dog." The captain looked at Kane's swollen knee, the scorched Pulaski, the rough handlines scratched through duff. "You cut this overnight?" "Started before full involvement." "Hell of a thing." Kane shrugged. Fire had a path. I gave it a different argument. They hiked down to his cabin to check for spot ignition. 2 firefighters stomped out a smoking stump near his woodpile. Another scraped around his propane tank. "Any civilians, hunters, transients in the drainage?" the captain asked while filling out a field card. Kane kept his gaze on the ridge. "Saw no humans below grade. Wildlife moving erratic." "Tracks. Suppression traffic's going to mud it all anyway." He gestured vaguely toward West Timber. "There were some unusual prints before the burn. Couldn't preserve them." The captain grunted, wrote wildlife displacement likely, and moved on. By afternoon, containment lines held. By evening, the official language shifted to forward, spread checked. Kane slept 12 minutes at a time in a porch chair with boots on, waking to each helicopter thump. Juniper slept pressed to his ankle, bandage grey with soot. When the last engine rolled out 2 days later, the valley felt abruptly too quiet. Smoke haze hung in layers. The opposite ridge looked shaved and bruised, black fingers reaching down gullies where flame had run hottest. The bowl west of his cabin sat on the burn edge, charred around, not consumed through. The root plate remained. He did not go there. Instead, he filed his statement by radio at district request. Wind shift, observed fire behavior, self-protection actions, no known human casualties, no structures lost. Routine words for non-routine night. After he clicked off, he sat at the kitchen table with a cold mug of coffee and stared at his hands. They shook once, then steadied. Juniper limped in, dropped her head on his thigh, and looked up. "We made it," he said, surprised to hear belief in his own voice. Rain arrived on the third day and stayed, slow and patient, pressing smoke down into the duff and turning ash to paste. Kane spent the morning on ritual labor because ritual labor still worked when nothing else did. Clearing the microhydro intake with a rake, checking the penstock coupler, splitting the damp rounds that never stacked right, sharpening the Pulaski edge where it had rolled on basalt. Juniper followed with her stitched shoulder held stiff but healing, pausing at every gust from the west, as if listening for a note below weather. At noon, District called for one more witness check. Reynolds, Ops wants confirmation. Any observed flare in the West Bowl overnight? Kane watched rain bead on the porch rail. Negative visible flare from residents. Perimeter still smoking in pockets. No movement of concern near structures. Copy. We may fly recon if ceiling lifts. Copy. He set the mic down without adding anything. Inside, he opened his field notebook to the pages from before the fire. Thermal sketches, wind arrows, limp angle estimates, little practical boxes for water, and battery and route timing. He turned to a clean page and wrote in block print, "Fire moved the line. Boundary still holds." He left space beneath it and did not fill it. That evening, Juniper took a strip of dried venison from her bowl and carried it to the far spruce at the meadow edge, farther out than before. She laid it down, stepped back, and sat. No crouch now, no frantic appeasement, just watchful distance. Kane stood in the doorway long enough for rain to soak the shoulders of his flannel. Then he set a dented pan of water 10 yards short of where she had placed the meat, turned away, and went back inside without looking toward the trees. Near midnight, the low call came once from the west timber, so deep it trembled against his ribs and the glass in the kitchen cabinet. Not close. Not gone. Juniper raised her head from the rug, ears canted, then settled again when Kane stayed still. He reached for the handset out of habit, thumb over the side button where he kept old local numbers, including Halverson's. He held it there for 3 breaths, then set the radio back in its cradle untouched. No calls, no visitors, no new witness chain. By week's end, the rain had cooled most of the hot edge. Kane hiked as far as his knee would let him along the upper grade, marking hazard snags and scraping a little line where embers still found needles. He worked slowly and returned before dusk, keeping the old rules. No direct approach, no altered cache inside boundary, no noise that could be mistaken for pursuit. At night, he sat in Marlene's chair with an ice pack on his knee and Juniper's weight against his boot. He found himself speaking out loud to the dark the way he had in the first months after Marlene died. Not full conversations, just practical report-outs. Chains sharpened. Bandage looks clean. Winds east tonight. Sometimes he added, "I did what I could," and waited to see if the words rang false. Most nights they didn't. One morning he woke before light to Juniper's quiet chuff at the door. She wanted out, not to patrol, just to stand on the porch and face west while dawn bled into the burned ridge. He stood beside her in silence until color returned to the trees, and the call did not come. "Still there," he said anyway. Juniper leaned into his shin once and went back inside for breakfast. First real snow came in early November, heavy and clean, covering burn scars in a temporary mercy. At dusk, Kane carried a salt block to the far edge of his meadow where spruce shadows met open ground. He set it on a flat stone, then placed 4 apples beside it, red against white. Juniper stood nearby, calm, watching the tree line but no longer vibrating with alarm. He backed away without speaking. Morning found 1 apple gone. Next day, another. Tracks were indistinct, partly melted, partly wind-scoured, but something broad had stood at the edge of light and left without crossing into the yard. By January, the cold went hard enough to wring metal. One dawn, Kane opened his door to a sky the color of tin and saw Juniper already sitting on the porch railside, ears up, body loose. In front of her, on the cedar rail, sat a careful stack of 5 river stones, smallest on top, balanced with deliberate precision. No snow on the upper surfaces, recently placed. Kane stopped in the doorway so fast the hinge squealed. Juniper looked at him, then at the stones, then back, as if to say there. He stepped closer. The rocks were creek-smoothed basalt and quartzite from a bar 1/2 a mile down, not from his yard. The base stone held a faint smear of ash-dark mud, and one coarse hair caught in a rough edge. He did not touch the stack at first. He just stood there in his robe and boots, breath fogging, while the woods held their winter quiet. After a long minute, he set one gloved finger against the bottom stone, not enough to shift it, just enough to feel cold and wait. "Thank you," he said softly, to air and timber and whatever listened beyond both. Juniper leaned against his shin. He left the stones on the rail. By spring runoff, the burn scar was already stippled with green, fireweed points, grass blades, stubborn life, pushing through black duff. Kane built the second porch chair on a clear April afternoon. He planed cedar slats on the bench Marlene used to hate because it collected screws. He muttered at measurements, recut one armrest twice and sanded edges until Juniper quit, flinching at the rasp. The finished chair wasn't pretty, but it was square and solid, set beside his own with both angled toward the west tree line. At 6 p.m., the district weather net crackled through his handheld. Humidity recovery poor, winds variable, holdover checks continuing in adjacent drainages. Kane listened, acknowledged his call sign when prompted, and gave nothing more than weather back. Afterward, he set the radio face down on the table and carried 2 mugs to the porch out of habit, filling only one. Evening settled gently over the drainage. Ravens crossed high. Creek noise rose with meltwater. Somewhere in the west timber, deep and far, a single low note drifted on the wind, too faint to classify, too familiar to ignore. Juniper lifted her head toward the trees. Kane lifted his too, steady now, not hollow, and waited without needing anything to step out.